Hello everybody, and I hope you are all well. Thank you very much for joining us for our series of Wild Chat Together Apart talks. My name is Wendy Collinson, and I just want to take you through a few of the house rules so that those of you who have never joined us before on any of these chats, you'll know how things work. So firstly, you'll see that you are muted. So you won't be able to ask questions during the presentation or at the end, but you'll find if you hover your cursor near the bottom of the screen, there is a question and answer box or Q&A box. So you'll be able to type your questions in there, and even during the presentation you can type in your questions, and I'll do my best to answer them at the end if there's time. And if we don't get time for it, you'll see my email details at the end of the presentation and you'll be able to contact me directly. I think then we will start, and as I said, thank you very much for joining us. Okay, just trying to go to the first screen picture. Okay, just give me a minute. Struggling at the moment to get to my first image. Just getting a quick bit of help from our IT department, who we rely on very heavily. Thanks, Eve, you're a star. Okay, so everyone should have my screen in front of them now. Thank you, Eve, for helping me out. Okay, so today's presentation is about how we go about protecting the protected. So when I talk about protected, I'm talking about our national parks or protective areas of the country. What I want to share with you is one of our research projects that we are doing. And don't worry, it's not all technical science. It's quite exciting science. And I'm going to be talking to you about how we go about designing some of our projects. So for those of you who joined one of my earlier presentations, you'll know that I work for the Endangered Wildlife Trust's Wildlife and Transport Programme, and our main focus is looking at the impacts of transport on wildlife, and this includes your roads, railways, ships and aircraft. And for the purpose of this presentation, we're focusing just on roads. But why do we actually need transport? Now, this may seem an obvious question, but when we talk about transport, we're talking about our roads and vehicles, we're talking about the trains, we're talking about aircraft, freight, so lorries that carry goods, and even ships out in our ocean. And due to the global pandemic, we know that a lot of our transportation networks have currently slowed down or even come to a big halt. But it's still critical to us, and we very much rely on our transportation networks because we have to develop our economies and we need goods to be transferred as well as people. So whilst it's very, very important that we have an efficient and functioning transport system, there are negative consequences. And we tend to divide these into two types. So you've got your direct and indirect. The direct are very, very visual and ones that probably all of you have seen. So here's one example where there's an aircraft attempting to take off and it's colliding into a flock of birds. Or very often on our roads, you'll see animals that get hit and either injured or killed. So this is one of your direct impacts. The less obvious ones are something that usually takes a long time to measure and fully understand. But there's vehicle emissions with gases that can damage not only animal health, but also our plants. And roads often act as barriers between animals wanting to cross from one side of the road to the other. And if you think about our current situation at the moment, whereby we have to abide by social distancing, if we think about this and compare the COVID-19 situation, you can compare that directly to a road. We are isolated from our friends, our family. If we cross from one side of the other, we run the risk of catching the virus. It's exactly the same for animals. If they risk crossing a road, it may have a negative consequence and they actually get run over. So the most obvious direct impact that often results from some of those indirect effects is roadkill. And one of the things that we're doing at the Endangered Wildlife Trust is trying to understand why roadkill happens. And in order to do that, we first have to measure how this happens. And this involves what we call collecting data or collecting figures. How many animals get killed on roads, for example, each day or each month or every single year. And one of the ways we do this is through asking experts as well as volunteers to help us gather this information. Because if you think about it, it's physically impossible to drive every single road in the country. And I'm not just talking about South Africa, I'm talking about roads all over the planet. So we rely very much on people to help us. And we have a number of methods of doing this. Sometimes people can just email us any roadkill that they see on the roads, or we actually also have a cell phone app where people can report some of their sightings. And even though it's very, very graphic and it's not pleasant to see, it really, really helps us understand what's happening. Now, this map just shows South Africa, and it shows you some of the points or data points of where roadkill has happened in the country. And you can see that the map on the left is every single red dot there is a roadkill. And the map on the right, we actually call a heat map. So based on the red dots on the left-hand side, you can turn that into a heat map, and the red areas are the areas where we have most reports coming from, and the areas that are the lighter green is where there's less. So effectively a heat spot. So this is how we collect our information, and it's on all our regional roads and highways. And we're also very, very active on social media. So Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and this is often how we receive some of our reports as well. Sometimes people will actually record a sighting and they'll submit it on the Facebook page. And this really leads to how we actually designed this study, Protecting the Protected, because it was an image like this, and yes, it's quite distressing, where we found that animals were starting to be injured or killed on roads in protected areas. Now, a protected area is a national park. The term may vary depending on which country you live in, but so it might be known as a nature reserve or a provincial park. But basically, it's a wildlife refuge where you would visit to go and see specific wildlife. And we never actually realised the extent of the potential problem of animals being killed in the protected areas, because a protected area, their role is to be the sworn custodians and protectors of biodiversity. So we were quite shocked to actually be seeing images like this on social media. And it started then to make us ask questions. So whilst we had been encouraging people to send us information about animals that they'd seen killed on the regional and national roads, we then started to dig a little bit deeper as to why this was happening in our parks. So back in 2014, we started what we called our Roads and Parks project. And here you'll see a map of South Africa, and South Africa has numerous national parks across the entire country, but we selected 6 of them to work in, and you'll see in the top left-hand corner there a list of the 6 parks and the years where we've been working. So you'll see it's a very, very long project, and you'll see number 4 there is the Kruger National Park, which I think most of you, particularly if you're from overseas, you're most familiar with that park. Now, the reason why we selected different parks is because not only are they in different parts of the country, and so therefore have very, very different types of vegetation and possibly different animals, but due to their location, they may also vary with visitors. And when I say visitors, some of them may have more local visitors, so more South Africans, and others may have more internationals. So we were very interested in trying to understand the type of person that visited these parks. And back in 2014, we started just undertaking some preliminary work in Pilanesberg National Park. And this initially started with just firstly trying to understand the problem. So this goes back to my earlier slide where I said to you, we need to understand the initial problem before we can actually act or start to look at how we reduce the problems. So in 2014, we went to Pilanesberg, where we literally just drove every single road in the park, every single day for 30 days, and counted every single dead animal that we found. And this is what we saw. So we found almost 130 dead animals on the roads over a 30-day period. And you'll see that it was mainly amphibians, then reptiles, birds, mammals, and then there was a small amount of unknown. And these unknowns were things that were sadly so squashed that we couldn't identify. So what's very interesting here is that it was the smaller animals that were actually being killed most often on the roads. So what we then wanted to understand was, well, why is this happening? It really shouldn't be happening in protected areas where the animals are supposed to be safe. So in addition to doing our actual research, we did some questionnaire surveys with visitors to the park, and we asked them a number of questions, but the 2 main questions that we were interested in was, what did they think were the main reasons why animals were being killed on the roads? And I'm sure you're actually thinking in your heads of what that answer might be. So firstly, we asked them what they thought was the main reason outside a protected area, so on your regional and national roads, and then inside. And these were our results. So almost 100% of the people that we questioned said that speeding was the main cause of why roadkill happened on regional and national roads. And similarly, we almost have 100% saying it's people who are speeding inside national parks, and that's why roadkill happens. So based on this, this started to help us design our actual research project. So this is what we call a hypothesis. So we go about saying, well, we predict that speeding is the cause of roadkill, so let's test that. So we set out, first of all, by monitoring the traffic. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with seeing these strips on the roads. You'll often see them on our regional and national roads, and they are called speed traps, and they are designed to record the speed at which you drive, the number of vehicles that use that road, and they can also tell you the weight. And what I mean by that is that they can tell you whether it's a car, like what we see in the image there, or whether it's a truck, so effectively a light or a heavy vehicle. So we set up these traffic counters in Pilanesberg, but they didn't actually get set up as easily as we hoped and didn't come without their own challenges. This is what we found one day when we went out to do our roadkill counts. And you can see that what's happened here is that the actual traffic loops that record and monitor all the road, the traffic that's using the park roads were damaged. I wonder if you can guess who is the culprit. Yes, it was one of these guys, the elephants. Very, very temperamental to anything invading their environments. And they came along at night and decided to rip up all these tubes that were placed on the ground. Now, what you have to remember is that these things are pretty tough to pull up. These are exactly the type of traffic counting devices that we have on our standardized roads. So they're pretty tough, and yet elephants managed to rip them up. So we had to come up with a solution to prevent elephants from damaging our traffic loops. And this was what we started to use. Now, this is a fact for you. Elephants hate chilies. And so what we devised was we made our own chili oil, and every single day we had to go and spray our traffic loops with this chili oil to keep the elephants away from our traffic counters, and it worked. From that day onwards, we didn't have a single damaged traffic loop. So this just gives you an idea of some of the challenges that we actually have to face when we're doing our research, and how we have to think out of the box to try and come up with a solution for something that we weren't anticipating. So let's get back to actually what we found from the traffic devices. And this is when it gets interesting. So what I'm showing you here is a graph of the heavy and light vehicles. Remember, I talked about those traffic loops that could tell you what type of vehicle was driving on the road. And along the vertical bar, so the bar that goes up, you'll see the number of vehicles that we recorded. And across the bottom, you'll see all the times. And if we just look here, you'll see that there's a spike. So between 12:30 and 1 o'clock in the middle of the day, and 6:30 and 7 o'clock in the evening, there was an increase in drivers speeding. Now, those of you who have visited national parks may be able to guess the reason for this, but those of you who've never been into a park and don't really know much about animal behaviour or how a park works, what we normally find is that during the middle of the day, it's far too hot and animals aren't normally active. And so what then happens is people who have been out looking for animals on their game drive will very often return back to their rest camps to go and have their lunch, and clearly are in a little bit of a hurry to get back. So that's when you see that speeding spike. The end of the day, again, the same thing. People will either be hurrying back to their camps, or we have gates to many of our national parks, and they're very, very strict about these gates being closed. And if you don't get to the gate in time, you will often get a fine. So people often race to the gates to make sure that they can get out and exit the park. And again, this is where you see the spike in speeding. So what this graph is telling us is that, yes, there is some speeding in the park, but it's not consistent and it's not across the whole day. And even if we actually look at how many vehicles were speeding, and just bear in mind, I'm talking kilometres per hour. So those of you in countries that work in miles per hour, I can't actually do the conversion for you. Wish I had my dad here because he'd be doing it very, very quickly. But we'll see here that in Pilanesberg National Park, the speed limit is 40 kilometres an hour. Now look at this. These are all the vehicles that we recorded at those speeds. And as soon as we get to 40 kilometres an hour and over, yes, there were people speeding, but not a significant amount. In fact, most of them were only going 10 kilometres an hour over the speed limit. You can see here. And it was only approximately 30%. So really what this is telling us is that there aren't a huge percentage of people speeding. Yes, there are some, and yes, speeding may account for some of the animals being killed, but it certainly doesn't seem to be the main cause. So this is when research starts to get a little bit interesting, because you had this hypothesis, or you had this theory about what the cause of roadkill is, but actually your theory is wrong. And so you're then sat there scratching your head thinking, well, I'm not sure what the answer is. So this then left us in the position of thinking, well, if it's not speed that's causing roadkill, what is it? We then had to think about how people behave when they are in a protected area. So those of you who have ever visited a national park, you generally do drive quite slowly, don't you? Because the reason for that is because you want to see your wildlife. And if you think about it, where are you looking? You're looking from side to side, scanning the bush to see if you can see anything interesting. You're looking for that elephant. You're looking for that lion or leopard. So we then thought it has to actually be with the way the driver is behaving. And if you think about this, when you are driving on a national or regional road, your head is forwards. You have to concentrate because you're driving fast. You have to concentrate because you've got lots of other vehicles around you. And you're definitely not looking for animals in the bush because you're on a national and regional road. So this kind of fits our theory that people actually aren't looking at the road, they're looking to the side for animals. And if we think about it, one of the only things that you can maybe do to change driver behaviour is through warning them about driving slowly and driving safely. But do they work? Do these warning signs actually change drivers and make them drive slower? Now, in South Africa, this is one of the very common wildlife signs that we have on our regional roads. It's a picture of a kudu. I know in England they often have a picture of a deer, and I'm sure in other countries you have common animals that you see. And what we've noticed with these signs is because they're actually set in one place, and it's a very, very common image, people become what we call habituated to the sign. So you don't actually notice it. You drive, and if I were to ask you afterwards, did you see a sign and what was on it? You would probably scratch your head and think, actually, no, I didn't. So people often become used to a sign and don't change their behaviour. So this then made us think about how can we change driver behaviour in national parks, and what can we do with regards signs to actually make people more conscious and actually think twice and not become habituated. So we started to think about what other sorts of signs we can use. Now, we came up with some ideas for some photographic signs, and I think you'll agree these are quite eye-catching. And you've got 4 different animals here. So starting on the left, you've got a snake, then a cheetah, and then a mongoose, and then a chameleon. And the reason why we picked these 4 animals is because, given the information that we have received for our actual roadkill database, these are some of the animals that we have found killed most often on our roads. So we chose these 4 images, and we had photographs made up, and then we also did a similar thing using the red triangle, which goes back to our original image where you had that kudu jumping, but instead we used the actual same images as the photograph. So you'll see on the left hand side there's a silhouette of a chameleon, followed by a snake, then a cheetah, and the mongoose. Now, this is where it gets quite interesting, because if you remember at the beginning, I said to you, the whole project started because of social media. It was because people were posting on social media and saying how concerned they were about the number of animals that were being killed in national parks. So we decided to use these images, go back to good old social media, and ask people which image would be most likely to change their behaviour. So effectively, we did a poll on Facebook. So choosing those 4 animals, the snake, the cheetah, the mongoose, and the chameleon, we asked people to vote. Now, I'd be very interested to know your opinion before I show you the answers. Which of those 4 animals do you think you would be most likely to change your behaviour and slow down and actually be looking at the road so nothing would get run over? And which of those animals would you probably not take any notice of the sign and carry on driving as you are? So look at this. This is the snake. We found that hardly anybody was interested in changing their behaviour. In fact, the snake was the least popular out of all of them. In fact, some people actually said if they saw a snake sign and they saw a snake on the road, they would deliberately drive over it. That is how unpopular snakes are. Now look at this. This is the cheetah. You can see that the cheetah proved to be the most popular. I'm just going to put up the images. This was the mongoose. And here's our chameleon. So the cheetah was the most popular sign, and people actually said if they saw an image of a cheetah, then they would definitely change their behaviour. And so based on our social media poll, we chose the most popular and the least popular to test and see if we could actually make a difference and change the way that people behave in the protected areas. So we had 2 different types of signs made up. So we had the photograph, and we also had the silhouette for both the cheetah and the snake. Now, you might be thinking, well, how do you test this? How do you test whether it's effective? Well, this is what we used. We had a fake rubber snake, and we placed it on the road in the park, and we tested driver behaviour. So first of all, we tested it without any signs at all, and we call this in research a control test. So effectively, you just want to understand how people behave to a snake lying on the ground. Do they notice it, or do they not notice it at all? I.e., are they too busy looking from side to side for bigger animals? And then we put up our signs to see if that changed driver behaviour, whether they slowed down and they actually noticed the snake on the ground. Now, I mentioned to you that we did this work in Pilanesberg, but we also, as I said, we've been working in different parks in the country. And what I want to show you now is a video that we took in Addo Elephant National Park, where we did the same experiment with the snake and some of the results. So I think you agree that was quite interesting. We had a mixture of behaviour there, didn't we? Some people noticed the snake, some people were completely oblivious, some people actually swerved. We had people taking photographs, and at one point we even lost our snake. That pale chanting goshawk actually flew off with our snake and dropped it somewhere in the bush. So very, very interesting behaviour. And also quite shocking that some people were clearly speeding and didn't notice anything that was on the road. So that was a visual interpretation of the results. But just to actually, for those of you who do want more concrete statistical information, you'll see at the bottom of this slide, this is a scientific paper that we actually published with regard to this study. And I just wanted to share this information with you because I do think this is quite interesting. So this is from almost 3,000 drivers that we observed in Pilanesberg. So when we didn't have any of those signs up, when it was just the fake snake on the road, 35% of the drivers did change their behaviour. And when I say they changed their behaviour, it's very similar to that video. They either stopped or they swerved to make sure that they didn't actually run over the snake. So in general, you know, there was a very small percentage, approximately a third actually did notice that there was a snake on the road. As soon as we put our signs up though, this got interesting. We found that almost 2/3 of the drivers did actually change their behaviour when we put up the signs. So those signs did actually make a difference. Now this is really interesting, because I bet if I said to you, who do you think are the biggest culprits of killing animals in the parks, what we've noticed on social media is, and I'm sure you've all heard of Facebook trolls, you'll get people being very, very slanderous and attacking some of the staff in the protected areas, saying they're the ones that are to blame, they're the ones that are causing most of the fatalities. And what we actually found was the reverse to be true. It was mainly the visitors to the park that were actually running over the snake, as opposed to the staff. And this is very, very useful for the national parks as part of their management strategy, to actually come up with a traffic management plan going forwards. And this was what we were not expecting. Do you remember from social media, the poll that we did, when we asked people which image they would be most likely to change their behaviour for? Well, we found the complete reverse to be true. We were expecting the image of the cheetah to be the most common one, where the snake did not get run over. In actual fact, we found the image of the snake to be the most effective at getting drivers to change their behaviour. So what we've learned from this is that an image, be it a silhouette or a photograph of a smaller animal, is more likely to change driver behaviour and make a difference. And currently what we're busy with in the national parks, particularly Kruger National Park, is looking at putting up some different signs throughout the park in some of the areas that we've identified as where most roadkill occurs, but using the image of a smaller species to try and encourage people to look at the road. And, you know, hey, if you're going to look at the road, you might actually see some really, really cool wildlife. Snakes, we know, like to bask on the road. There's tortoises that like to cross the road. And sometimes you can see some really, really interesting wildlife. So rather than looking to the side, it should encourage you to actually look at the road. So the project, the Roads in Park project, we also encourage you to help us where you can. It's really important that we continue to gather information. And as I said earlier on, one of the ways we do this is through using a cell phone app. So if you haven't downloaded this, it's very easy to do. This is all you need to do. Go to the Google Play Store and type in the EWT Road Watch. And that's the end of my presentation. So I'd just like to thank you all for listening. I'll try and answer some of the questions now, I think. And if I don't get to all the questions, you can see my email address at the bottom there, which you can contact me on, and I'm more than happy to chat with you offline. Okay, so I think I've got my video up, and I'm going to go to the Q&A. Okay, so we have a couple of questions here. Karine has asked, good question, Karine. She says, good afternoon. Would it be possible to create or change bad roads with holes and bumps? Karine, that's a very interesting question, and something that we have actually noticed. Some parks that we've worked in, the roads aren't in fantastic condition. So I think what you're alluding to here is potholes, and if there's potholes in the road, then obviously you are going to drive slowly. So often it's in the park's interest to not repair the road, because then you're going to make people drive slowly. So, you know, it swings and roundabouts, because if you're driving in a car and there's a pothole, you're potentially going to damage your vehicle, which you're not going to be happy about. But if there's a pothole, then you are going to drive slower. So, you know, it's a kind of catch-22. So it's a nice question, and it's a nice way of thinking about it. Liam, did you check out the new signs, snake, cheetah, etc., against the kudu sign? Liam, you've caught us out. Actually, this is exactly what we're doing in Kruger, and we've just finished doing this. So the work that we did in Kruger, we used the image of the snake and the cheetah, which we had used in Pilansberg, but what we also tested was the kudu sign, and we also used an image of a speed camera, because we know that often that speed camera on the regional and national roads sometimes makes people change their behaviour. And Liam, I wonder if you can guess what was successful. So the least successful sign was actually the kudu sign. People didn't change their behaviour. Then the speed camera, followed by the cheetah sign and the snake sign. So again, we did find a significant difference, and it's interesting that we found that that kudu sign didn't work as effectively as we hoped, which then leads us on to thinking about, well, if it's not working in the protected area, surely we need to be looking at different types of signage on our regional and national highways. So certainly something to think about. Okay, we have a question from Eleanor Mary. Have you considered putting up more information about roadkill and advice on driver behaviour in the park camps so that you can catch people before you drive on the roads? Yeah, that's a great question. And as a result of the research that we've been doing, it's basically now feeding into the park traffic management plan. So we've been able to directly use the information to guide them with ways forward. And one of the ways forward is to create more awareness. So we actually did have some posters that we put up in the parks, and we are looking at, when people go in through the gates to the parks, actually having a bit more information in the guidebooks, or potentially forcing people to actually watch a video on how to behave in the park before they're actually allowed access. And that video can not just include about looking out for animals on roads, it could certainly include something about, you know, what happens when there's an elephant that charges you, or don't be an idiot and get out of your vehicle when there's wildlife around. So, you know, there's various tools that the national parks are looking at, one of which would certainly include roadkill and how to drive responsibly. So thanks for that, Eleanor. I think we've just got time for a couple more questions. Sarah, fascinating presentation, thank you. Do you worry that once lockdown is finished and visitors are able to go back to protected areas, that there will be a significant increase in roadkill, as the wildlife will have been used to using the roads without any traffic? Sarah, this is the million-dollar question that researchers are asking all over the world. And I don't know if it's the correct thing to say, but I'm incredibly excited about finding out this information, because we've certainly noticed, not just in the protected areas, but with regards some of the toll companies that we work with in South Africa, namely the N3TC, the Quena and Track N4, that because of the reduced traffic on the roads, we've noticed animals are changing their behaviour. So whereas animals would not normally have attempted to cross the road, do you remember me talking earlier about the barrier effect and how animals will either avoid a road or attempt to cross it? We've noticed that animals are starting to get more confident and start to hang around roads. And this now provides us with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see what will now happen with that behaviour. Will animals still continue to exhibit that behaviour and attempt to cross the road and roadkill numbers increase? Or will they revert back to their original behaviour and start to avoid roads? So it's an incredibly interesting question, and something that I'm really interested to find out. And obviously I hope that roadkill doesn't increase, but yeah, there's so many scientists across the world that are asking this question. So yeah, thanks for raising that. I think we've got time for one more question. Okay, Lil. Okay, do you only consider records with photos? No. It does actually help if there is a photograph, because when that information is submitted from the member of the public and there's a photograph with it, we can then verify it for the accuracy. If no photograph is submitted, you can't guarantee the accuracy of the submission. And we have noticed this in the past. For example, we've had people say that it was an African wild dog that was killed on the road. And as we know, African wild dogs are an endangered species. And then when we've asked someone to go and check out what the roadkill actually was, it turned out to be a hyena. So unless there's a photograph, we can't rely 100%, but we do make a note of that in our records. We have what we call a degree of accuracy rating. So that certainly is something that we would encourage you to do, to submit with a photograph, but we recognise it's not always possible, and certainly it's not always safe for you to stop and take a photograph. Okay, I think I'm just going to answer one more question, and then all the other questions, I hope you'll be able to contact me on my email address, and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, so will your presentation be available, including your dialogue, to share with colleagues? Absolutely. This has all been recorded and it will be on YouTube, and Belinda Glenn and Eve Manana, who are IT and comms managers, will be putting this up onto our Endangered Wildlife Trust Facebook page. So I would imagine that will be up later this evening. You'll be able to go to that, get that information, then share that with your colleagues. And I would be really grateful if you could, because I think this is really critical for raising awareness and making a difference in our national parks. So I think that's all we've got time for. I really, really appreciate those people that joined us, and I know some people couldn't, so please share the YouTube clip if you can, and I look forward to chatting with some of you soon. Okay, take care.